Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean, historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. Christmas Memories by Emma Ashwood. Chapter 1. Carol Arthurs walked through the kitchen into the dining room and drew in a deep breath. The scent of pine polish and candle wax filled her lungs, along with the softer notes of the roses which graced the foyer. A smile lifted the corners of her mouth as she swung in a circle. The furniture was polished to a high gleam, the chandeliers shiny enough to see your reflection. The house was beautifully kept and even more beautifully decorated. She let her hands slide along the banister as she descended the stairs to the foyer. Laughter bubbled from her throat as she let her fingers slide across the keys of the piano as she stepped into the drawing room. The curtains were drawn back, letting the morning light spill into the room. Dust motes played in the sunbeams as she held out her arm and pretended to accept a dance. Carol twirled, her golden hair spilling over her shoulders before she misjudged a step and tumbled onto the settee. "Carol Arthurs, do you want to get me fired?" Her mother's voice screeched in a hushed whisper from the door. Carol sat up straight and quickly swallowed back the laughter as her eyes grew large as saucers. "Mother? Don't you mother me. If the housekeeper or the butler found you traipsing through the house, I'll be out of a job and will be back in East Harlem faster than you can explain why you were here." Her mother's hands were cocked on her hips, her brow raised, making it clear no argument was needed. Carol nodded somberly and got up to follow her mother back into the kitchen. As soon as they were alone, her mother turned and let out a heavy sigh. "Carol, I know you love to pretend that this is our house, but it isn't. Mr. and Mrs. Smithers might be fair employers, but they won't be as forgiving if they know you traipse around freely whenever they're out." Carol nodded. "I'm sorry, Mother. I know it's foolish, but I love to pretend that." "You're the lady of the manor?" her mother asked with a gentle voice. "I know, my darling girl, but you're not. You're the cook's daughter, and the sooner you come to accept our station in life, the sooner you will be happy. I know you think that I work like a slave and that it isn't fair, but Carol, you're 16 years old and it's time you realized that life isn't fair. Before the Smithers came to New York, we were living in a tenement apartment in East Harlem. Do you remember how little food we had, or the long hours I had to work to make ends meet?" Carol remembered that time all too well. The dark and musty-smelling apartment, the meals that rarely consisted of more than stale bread and water. "I remember, Mother." "If you remember, you'll be wise to remember that we struck it lucky when I was hired as a cook for the Smithers. We might live in the servants' quarters, Carol, but at least we have a home that is warm in winter, and we have never gone to bed hungry again." Her mother let out a sigh and sat down, beckoning Carol to join her at the table. "When you turned 16, Mrs. Smithers was well within her rights to insist you move out. Instead, she offered you a position as a maid. Stop playing, my dear girl, and start working." Carol nodded. "But Mother, it just isn't fair. We slave away while they don't do a single thing, and yet they live a life of comfort and ease. Did you see the new golden chandeliers in the drawing room? I had to polish them yesterday." "Yes, I did see them, and that is of no consequence to us. Some are born into wealth, and others never achieve it, but money doesn't bring you happiness. It's best if we are grateful for what we have and work every day to make sure we're not going back to East Harlem." "Yes, Mother," Carol nodded. Stren 7%. She knew her mother was right, but she wished that one day she could have a pretty house. She dreamed of having her own home to clean and not having to clean the homes of others. The Smithers were indeed fair and kind employers, but Carol dreamed of more. She dreamed of a different life, one with adventures to be had, friends to visit, and a life in which her mother didn't have to slave over a stove 7 days a week. "Don't give me that look." Her mother sighed. "Go on, you best get upstairs and start cleaning the rooms before they return from their morning tea." Carol stood up without saying a word. She collected her basket of cleaning equipment, before tying her apron on and heading upstairs. As she worked, she thought of the Smithers. They had come to New York from London 5 years ago. It had been pure luck that her mother was hired as their cook only a week after their arrival. Carol and her mother had stayed in the servants' quarters of the brownstone ever since. Carol couldn't help but wonder what her life would have been like if her father were still alive. She hardly had any memory of him, and yet she often missed him. Carol had only been 5 years old when her father died in an accident at the docks. Carol still remembered the day his boss came to their apartment to bring the news. On that day, everything had changed. Carol had stayed with a neighbor while her mother worked shifts at a factory. For the next few years, the winters had been cold and life harder than it had ever been before. At the memory of those terrible years, Carol couldn't help but feel guilty for her frivolity that morning. Her frivolous saunter through the main house could cost them their livelihood. She never wanted to go back to East Harlem. A sigh escaped her as she made the Smithers' bed. She always dreamed of a better life, but perhaps her mother was right. She was 16 years old, and it was time to forget about fairy tales and realize that life was never going to get much better. It was time to let her fairy tale dreams go and focus on the task at hand. Carol pushed away the dreams of true love and a better life and got to work. Chapter 2. The entire staff stood gawking with wide eyes at the monstrosity in the parlor. Carol stood in awe of the large tree that had been brought inside. The entire house smelt of pine needles, and the glass baubles that hung from the trees were the most beautiful she'd ever seen in her life. "I wonder what Mr. Smithers is going to say about this," the butler mumbled to the housekeeper. "Never mind, Mr. Smithers, who's going to clean up the needles when they start falling?" "A foolish endeavor is what I'd call it," the housekeeper answered. Carol smiled and shook her head. "Wonderful is what I'd call it. Just looking at it makes it feel like Christmas." "Christmas, bah," the butler huffed. "Foolish is what it is." Mrs. Smithers lit the last candle and stood back to admire the tree. "Isn't it wonderful? Why no one thought of this before is beyond me. It truly does bring Christmas home, doesn't it?" Mrs. Smithers turned to look at her staff, and everyone nodded eagerly in agreement. She paid their wages and hopefully a small bonus for Christmas, so no one would argue with her now. Just then the door opened and Mr. Smithers walked into the parlor. He set down his bag and took off his hat before turning to greet his wife. "Margaret, what on earth is that?" Mr. Smithers roared at the sight of the giant tree that had taken over the corner of the parlor. Mrs. Smithers laughed. "Darling, why, it's a Christmas tree, of course." "A Christmas tree? It's a pine tree standing in my parlor," he cried out, clearly not as enchanted by the tree as Carol or Mrs. Smithers. Carol felt her mother reach for her elbow as the staff receded into the kitchen. They might be privy to the lives of the Smithers, but although arguments could be heard, they always made a point of leaving the room. They closed the kitchen door, and the housekeeper instantly mumbled her agreement with Mrs. Smithers. Carol didn't even bother listening to the complaints about the pine needles or the scent. She had her ear against the door, listening to the argument playing out in the room beyond. "Margaret, I don't know what foolish idea this was, but I want that tree out of this house this instant," Mr. Smithers roared. "That tree won't be leaving this house until the new year. The sooner you make peace with it, the better. Darling, everyone has one. Ever since Prince Albert put one up in Buckingham Palace, it's become a symbol of status. Surely you want everyone paying us a visit over the festive season to know our place in society." Carol gasped. She had never been to England, but she was fascinated by stories of kings, queens, and princes, and the palaces they called home. "Prince Albert, you say?" Mr. Smithers asked a little calmer. Mrs. Smithers chuckled. "Yes, dear. It's a German tradition that the prince brought into the palace. Surely you can agree that if the Queen of England can put up with some pine needles and the scent of pine, then so can we." "And the candles, are they really necessary?" Mr. Smithers asked in a lower voice. Carol crouched and peeked through the keyhole to see him inspect the tree. "Of course, the candles symbolize the everlasting life of Christ. It's a beautiful tradition, dear. One that I'd like us to honor, starting this Christmas. Although no one spoke of it, Carol knew that Mrs. Smithers couldn't bear children. She wondered if that was why Mr. Smithers often gave in to her demands. Then it's a new tradition. Just make sure the help keep an eye on the candles and the needles. Come Christmas, the entire house will be covered in them. Mrs. Smithers laughed. The butler keeps a firm hand on the household. You don't have to worry about that. Carol Arthur's eavesdropping is abhorrible. Get away from that door at once. Carol straightened and quickly rushed away from the door at her mother's command. Back to work, the butler called out to everyone in the kitchen. Carol nodded and quickly rushed off to continue with her day's work, thinking the entire time about the tree. One day, she promised herself she too would have a Christmas tree. She didn't care if it was small or if she couldn't afford the glass baubles. She just wanted to have a tree that made the house smell like Christmas. From that very moment, Carol knew the scent of pine needles would always remind her of Christmas. That night, she fell asleep, dreaming of a beautiful Christmas, one during which she would not be required to hide in the servants' quarters. A Christmas where she could decorate the tree, one where the gifts beneath the tree would be for her. When she woke up, it wasn't dawn yet. Carol quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her mother. It was Christmas Day, and although the day held no special connotation for the servants, she hoped to take a peek at the Christmas tree one last time before her day's work began. Carol slipped on a robe and quietly tiptoed through the kitchen. She passed through the dining room into the parlor, her breath simply caught at the sight of the candles lighting up the tree. The light reflected off the glass baubles, making it seem magical. Underneath the tree were numerous gifts, all beautifully wrapped. A fire was burning in the hearth, warding off the cold from the snow falling outside. Carol took a seat on a parlor chair, promising she'd only stay for a moment. Just another moment to admire the beautiful tree. The scent of pine needles filled the house, along with the scent of candle wax. It was the most beautiful Christmas she'd ever experienced. Although she'd be busy with chores for most of the day and would be lucky to have some of the leftovers from the feast her mother was preparing, she enjoyed the spirit of Christmas while the whole house still slept. Carol's breath caught when a strong hand settled on her shoulder. She was about to cry out, but stifled the instinct, knowing she would only get into trouble for being here. She turned to apologize, thinking it was the butler who'd caught her, but when she looked up, it wasn't the butler standing behind her, but Mr. Smithers. "See something you like?" Mr. Smithers slurred. Carol had never seen a drunk man before, but the moment the stench of drink hit her, she knew she was in trouble. Fear crawled up her spine even as she tried to move away from his touch. "I'm sorry, sir. I was just looking. I'd best get back to the servants' quarters," Carol said, trying to stand up. Mr. Smithers' hand dug into her shoulder. "No, stay. I'll make sure it's the best Christmas you've ever had. I've got the perfect gift in mind." All her mother's warnings about men and their dishonorable intentions came to mind. Carol had never found herself in a position in which she feared a man's touch, but at that moment she knew she was in trouble, the type of trouble that could cost her mother her job if she didn't find a way to escape. "I really have to go," Carol pleaded. Mr. Smithers laughed as he moved around to look her in the eye. He brushed away her still sleep-tousled hair. "I've always thought you're a pretty one." Carol's blood ran cold, realizing there was no escape when suddenly she heard the kitchen door open. "Carol Arthurs, you get into the kitchen right this second. You're not too old for a whippin', girl," her mother's voice said sternly as she took in the situation from the dining room. Carol scampered away from Mr. Smithers. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I'm coming." Carol rushed past her mother into the kitchen, feeling her legs buckle beneath her weight as her mother spoke to Mr. Smithers. "I'm truly sorry, sir. She's young and the tree simply enchants her. I'll make sure she doesn't bother you again." Her mother stepped into the kitchen and took one look at Carol before wrapping her arms around her. "Did he hurt you?" "No, mother," Carol said, as the tears began to stream over her cheeks. "I was so afraid." "I know. There now, I know," her mother soothed as she held her. "I know you think I'm a foolish old woman, Carol, but men are dangerous, especially if they're above your standing. No one will ever believe you were innocent. Promise me you'll never go wandering through the house again." Carol bobbed her head up and down. She had always ignored her mother's warning, but at that moment she knew that if her mother hadn't found her in time, she would have regretted not listening sooner. "Never, Mother, I promise, never again." "Very well, then." Her mother sighed and framed her face as she searched her gaze. "Merry Christmas, my darling girl. May you be blessed this year." Carol nodded, not feeling very blessed. Although Mr. Smithers had only touched her shoulder, she felt violated in the worst of ways. Chapter 3. The Smithers home was in a state of chaos. Tonight was the Christmas party. Mrs. Smithers had been planning for the last 3 months. The most important members of society were attending, including the mayor of New York. In the kitchen, Carol's mother was cooking up a storm, helped by the 3 girls who had been hired for the occasion. The butler was in a tiz as last-minute checks were made throughout the house. Everything needed to be dust-free and polished to a high shine. Carol had never been so tired in her life, but she preferred the hard work to thinking. Because if she thought, the reality of her life would just come crashing down on her. Ever since the Christmas before, she had to be careful every second of every day. Mr. Smithers had developed an interest in her a year before, and hadn't stopped trying to make advances on her ever since. Every room was scanned before she entered, and the bedchambers locked once she was inside. Carol lived in a constant state of fear, and she was exhausted because of it. It had been the Christmas tree that had lured her out before dawn the year before, and this year she barely stopped to admire it. She didn't want to chance Mr. Smithers finding her with her guard down. Many times she had pleaded with her mother for them to leave, but her mother insisted they wouldn't find a better employer or a better home. Carol understood that, and she was grateful for a full belly and a warm room, but she couldn't help but wonder if that was all her life would ever be. She spent her life trying to be invisible, and when she wasn't, she was cooped up in the tiny room behind the kitchen, which she shared with her mother. She had finally come to accept that the Christmases she had dreamed of as a young girl were never going to happen. Her life would be spent working for the Smithers and hoping that one day Mr. Smithers would forget she even existed. "Carol, the ladies' drawing room upstairs needs to be dusted again," the housekeeper called out in a firm voice as she came down the stairs. Carol nodded before rushing upstairs to do just that. As she cleaned, she thought of the people who would attend tonight's Christmas ball. They would be having their hair done and getting their gowns ready for the most beautiful event, while Carol would be in the background making sure it was a night they'd always remember. One day, she vowed, as she finished in the ladies' drawing room, she too would enjoy Christmas instead of working to make sure it was enjoyed by people wealthier than her. Chapter 4. Spencer Boardman paced the length of the porch, regardless of the blizzard coming in over the mountain. The wind was howling, bringing with it the frosty air from the Arctic, but Spencer hardly noticed. When another cry sounded from inside the cabin, he groaned and shook his head. Spencer had never been one to stand back in times of need, and today, for the first time in his life, he was told to do just that. His heart was racing, wishing he could do something to help, but he knew there was nothing for him to do. Nothing but to wait. He turned at the edge of the porch and paced back again. He had started the wait inside a few hours ago. He had sat by the fire and waited for news, but after a few hours, he couldn't just sit and wait anymore. Instead, he came outside to pace. At least he was moving. At least he was doing something. Another painful cry sounded from inside the cabin, and he pinched the bridge of his nose. He knew men had been standing by waiting for their women to birth children since the dawn of time, and yet he felt like the first man who had to listen to his wife cry out in pain. He heard footsteps rush towards the door and opened it, even as the midwife reached for it. "Spencer, you can start boiling some water. Your babe's about to be born," the midwife said with a smile as she rushed back into the cabin. Spencer drew in a sharp breath, the cold air scorching his lungs before he stepped into the cabin. He let the door slam shut as he raced to the stove to boil the water again that he had boiled hours before. As he waited for the water to come to the boil, he thought of Daisy suffering the most excruciating pain. He had fallen in love with her the moment he had set eyes on her in town 3 years before. She had just arrived in Black Mountain with her family, fresh from the city. Those first few months while Spencer courted her, she had been as skittish as a filly. She had been accustomed to a different type of life outside of the city, one in which you didn't have to check the outhouse for rattlers before going inside. Her father had come west to open the bank in Black Mountain, and when the bank was up and running, her family had returned east. Daisy had given him one look and asked whether he had a reason for her to stay, and they had been married that very day. A smile curved the corners of his mouth. Daisy was his sophisticated flower from the East, but regardless of her privileged upbringing and private schooling, she had fit in with the folk of Black Mountain with ease. Her kindness and generosity had soon won most of the townsfolk over, and if Spencer had any doubts about her ability to become a rancher's wife, they had been eased within months of their marriage. Daisy wasn't afraid of hard work or the harsh climate, just like Spencer knew she wasn't afraid of pain. When he heard her cry out again, he snapped back into action to check the water. Bubbles formed at the bottom of the pot, and Spencer let out a sigh of relief. He carefully transferred the water into a bucket when the shrill cries of a baby suddenly filled the air. His heart stopped for a moment as a smile split his face in two. He was a father. The midwife rushed into the kitchen with a beaming smile. "Spencer, you have a daughter, a beautiful, healthy baby girl. Both mother and babe are doing just fine." Spencer sighed with relief. "Thank you, Martha. Thank you. Here's the water. Need anything else?" Martha shook her head. "Nope. I'll just be tending Daisy. I'll let you know as soon as you can come in to meet your daughter." Spencer nodded gratefully before he moved to the fire. He added a few more logs to the flames, making sure the cabin didn't cool down in the least. They had a baby to take care of now. He glanced at the Christmas tree standing beside the hearth and shook his head. Daisy had insisted on a tree for their baby, and, lucky for them, their daughter had arrived just in time for Christmas. Beneath the tree stood the cradle he had spent months making himself. He couldn't help but chuckle when he remembered his first attempt. Needless to say, his first attempt was now nothing more than ashes in the hearth. The second attempt had turned out pretty fine, even if he had to say so himself. When another cry sounded from the room, Spencer stilled. The baby had been born. Surely Daisy shouldn't still be crying out in pain. His legs began to run even before he realized it. He slammed his fist against the door. "Martha! Martha! What's going on? Spencer!" "Just wait." Martha called back, but Spencer could hear Daisy's quiet groans and gasps for air through the door, even as the baby cried. The door opened, and Martha was smiling, a big contrast to his wife's cries of pain that sounded from inside the room. "Martha, I thought you said it's over?" Martha laughed. "Spencer, remember how Daisy kidded when she said her babe kicks enough for two?" Spencer's eyes widened. "There's another one?" Martha nodded. "Twins. Daisy's exhausted, but she'll pull through. You just go on and wait by the fire. I'll let you know when there's news." The door shut in his face, and Spencer let out a heavy sigh, even as joy washed over him. He and Daisy had always dreamed of having a large family. He just never imagined their family would start off with 2 babies instead of 1. He walked towards the fire and chuckled at the single crib beneath the Christmas tree. He'd have to make another. His eye caught the Bible that stood on the side table, and warmth flooded his heart. Daisy had been the one who made a religious man out of him, and he knew now more than ever before that there had to be a God. How else could he have been blessed with such a beautiful wife? He had a successful ranch, and his beef herd was growing by the day. Now he didn't have one, but 2 babies, 2 beautiful babies for him to love and spoil. He would teach them how to be ranchers, regardless of whether they were both girls or a pigeon pair. A girl needed to be able to handle herself in the West. Daisy was a perfect example of that. She might have been raised on tea cakes and silk, but she wielded a shotgun with confidence and wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. He sat down by the fire. This time his wife's cries of pain weren't as disconcerting as before. Instead, he knew with every cry that he was closing to having another child. The afternoon turned to evening before he finally heard the cries of another baby sounding through the cabin. This time he walked to the door, waiting for Martha to give him the news. He wanted more than anything to kiss his wife and tell her how proud he was of her, but he knew it was his place to wait until the midwife let him into the room. He waited for almost 5 minutes before the door opened and Martha smiled. "It's a boy, Spencer. A baby boy and a baby girl for Christmas. I'd say this is your best Christmas yet." Spencer laughed. "Definitely, Martha. How is Daisy?" "Exhausted, but well. She's feeding her babies. I'll let you in shortly. Let me just clean up first." Spencer nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Martha." "It's my pleasure. I can't remember the last time I brought twins into the world. They'll bring you such joy, Spencer." Martha closed the door and disappeared back into the room. Spencer headed to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee. It was Christmas Eve, and he was a father. He glanced at the Christmas tree and smiled as he whispered a quiet prayer. "Thank you, Lord. You truly are gracious and merciful. I promise to raise them with love and kindness, and I'll raise them knowing your word and following your guidance." Chapter 5. Carol woke up coughing in the early hours of the morning. She gasped for air, realizing her lungs weren't getting their fill. Her eyes fluttered open, only to be singed by the smoke. Carol waved a hand in front of her face, hoping to clear the smoke to be able to see what was going on. When she realized her vision wasn't hampered by the dark, but in fact by smoke, fear raced up her spine. The acrid taste of fire burned her lungs as she realized what was going on. She crawled out of bed, trying to stay beneath the smoke, but the smoke was so thick that her efforts were to no avail. She raced towards her mother's side of the room and tried to rouse her from sleep, but her mother wouldn't move. When she heard someone call out, she cried back, screaming for help. "Help! Help!" Her eyes teared up not only because of the burning smoke, but because she knew help was too late for her mother. Just the night before, she had heard Mr. Smithers telling his wife that the candles on the Christmas tree were going to burn the house down sooner or later. Carol had thought nothing of it. Now she wasn't so sure. The door to the servants' quarters room burst open, and a man rushed inside. Come with me." Carol shook her head, touching her mother's hand. "No, I can't move my mother." The man rushed to her side, where he touched her mother's neck. Carol already knew what he was going to say, but she wasn't ready to accept it. "I'm sorry, miss, but she's gone. So are all the others. Come, let's get you out." Carol couldn't comprehend what he meant by the others, but the next thing she knew, she was being dragged out of the servants' quarters, through the kitchen, and out the back door to where a group of people had gathered. "I found one," the man called out to the crowd, who breathed a collective sigh of relief. Carol couldn't fathom what was happening, but when she turned to look back at the brownstone in which she had been living for the last 6 years, realization slammed into her like a ton of bricks. The once beautiful home was going up in flames. Glass burst from the windows, shattering onto the sidewalk as people rushed back with surprise. Flames roared out of the upstairs windows, the bright flames lighting up the night sky. It was just after midnight, but Carol knew Christmas would never again be the same. She watched as men tried to douse the flames with water, as neighbors tried to protect their homes against the raging fire, but it all seemed in vain. Not only had the fire already taken her home, her employers, and her mother, it had also taken Christmas. Tears quietly seeped over her cheeks as she realized she didn't even have a spare dress or shoes to wear. She had been dragged out in nothing but her nightclothes and suddenly felt awfully aware of all the strangers watching as the house burnt down. Carol had always been a very religious person, but at that moment, she couldn't understand how God could just sit by and do nothing. Her heart felt as if some of the shards of glass that exploded from the windows had lodged there. She had no comprehension of time as men and women carried buckets of water to the house. By the time the fire finally died out, the first light of dawn shone on the horizon. One by one, spectators moved back to their homes. The excitement was over, and Christmas had to begin. But for Carol, there would be no Christmas. She thought of the beautiful Christmas tree with its most enchanting candles and couldn't fathom how something so beautiful could have brought such disaster. The police arrived, and one by one she watched as they carried the victims out. Her fellow staff members, her employers, and her mother. Carol knew that life would never be the same again. She just didn't realize how thoroughly her life would change. As families around her celebrated Christmas, Carol wept. While they made a toast to the beauty that was Christmas, Carol watched the ashes smolder before her eyes. As they welcomed guests, Carol mourned the loss of everyone she cared for. As they opened gifts, Carol finally summoned the courage to move into the wreckage to see if anything could be salvaged. The fire hadn't been merciful. It had consumed everything. From the beautiful oriental rugs to the Christmas tree, the drapes, and even the banister she had so many times admired when freshly polished. Carol headed to the room that she had shared with her mother and tried to search through the ashes and smoke-stained wreckage for anything she could keep. Her clothes, shoes, unmentionables, all ruined. She remembered the chest beneath her mother's bed, which mother had brought with them when they moved into the big house. She pried it open as tears streamed over her cheeks. Nothing inside had survived the fire. She was just about to close the chest when she noticed something in the corner of the chest. She closed her hand over it and found that it was still warm from the flames that had raged through the house a few hours before. She wiped it with the hem of her dress and gasped to find that the silver locket had survived. She held it close while she mourned the death of her mother, remembering it as the locket her father had given her mother on their wedding day. After a while, Carol summoned the courage to move about the room. She found nothing else she could keep. She had nothing left of her life, and all the years she had spent in the brownstone except for the silver locket. She walked through the rest of the house, seeing how the crystal glasses had shattered in the heat, the beautiful furniture all scarred by the fire. When she reached the drawing room, she noticed 2 golden candle holders had survived. Carol had never in her life taken anything that didn't belong to her, but she had less than nothing. Not clothes to wear, her last month's wages, or even shoes to step out into the snow that had fallen early that morning. Dear Lord, please forgive me, but I have no other choice. Carol walked towards the fireplace and took the 2 golden candle holders, and then she walked out of the brownstone. They weren't much, but they were enough for her to afford new clothes and at least accommodation until she could figure out what to do with the rest of her life. As a Christmas feast was served in most of the houses on the street, Carol walked past without anyone even noticing. As they filled their bellies with expensive cuts of meat, roasted vegetables, and wine, Carol's tummy growled, not knowing when she would get her next meal. Chapter 6. Spencer had known that a baby would mean sleepless nights, but he didn't realize that twins meant no sleep at all. He had never been so exhausted in his life, and he knew things were bound to get worse before they got better. After Daisy had given birth the day before, he had been ecstatic to get their Christmas underway. Martha had left to spend Christmas Eve with her own family, and Spencer had sat with Daisy, admiring their babies. Fortunately, the crib he had crafted was large enough for both babies until he had the time to build a second crib. If Daisy had looked a little pale or a little weak, he had put it down to her having birthed twins. It was only this morning that he realized she was beginning to look worse. She couldn't feed the twins and complained of excruciating pain. It might have been Christmas morning, but Spencer had settled the babies in their crib and raced into town to fetch the midwife. She had come rushing back to the cabin with him and once again closed him out of the room while she assessed his wife's condition. But this time, when she opened the door, she no longer had a smile on her face. Spencer sighed as he rested his head on Daisy's hand, which was covered in his own, as the memory washed over him of a few hours before. The midwife couldn't be sure if it had been the birth or the exertion of carrying twins, but she was certain that Daisy's uterus had ruptured. They were without a doctor in town, and surgery was out of the question. It was merely a matter of time. Martha had been kind enough to stay and care for the twins while Spencer sat by his wife's side. With every passing hour, he could see her fade even further. Every now and then, she would crane her neck to see the babies who were in the crib under Martha's care. All Spencer could think was that this wasn't how it was meant to be. They were supposed to be celebrating Christmas, their first as a real family. Instead, he was saying goodbye to the woman he loved more than he imagined possible. Spencer? Daisy's breathless voice made Spencer's eyes fly open to meet hers. "I'm here, my darling. I'm right here," Spencer promised, wishing there was something he could do to ease her pain. "Spencer, promise me you'll care for them. Promise me you'll teach them everything you can," Daisy begged. Spencer nodded. "Of course, I'll be the best pa I can, Daisy. You just rest and get better." He knew it was a futile request, but he couldn't look into her eyes and give up hope. "Spencer, there is something else you need to promise me. Promise me you'll find them a mother someday. A woman who can teach our little girl how to be a lady." Spencer shook his head. "You're the only woman I'll ever love." Daisy smiled quietly. "You have such a big heart, Spencer. You'll make room for someone else." "Hush now, my darling, rest," Spencer pleaded, regardless of the baby crying in the corner. He heard Martha shush the baby, but his gaze was focused on Daisy. They didn't have a Christmas. This shouldn't be their memory of Christmas, Spencer. Christmas is a time of joy, not grief. Spencer felt a tear slip over his cheek and quickly brushed it away. Christmas is a time for family. He stood up and scooped the baby out of Martha's arm before picking up the other baby and moving to Daisy's side. "Your whole family is right here with you." Daisy's mouth curved as a tear seeped from her eye. "I have been blessed with the most beautiful family," Spencer nodded, "and we were blessed with a wonderful mother and wife." "Spencer?" Daisy's voice faded even as the light began to fade from her eyes. There were no more words to be said, only quiet whispers of prayer. Spencer sat by her side as the afternoon grew into night. By the time midnight came, his wife was gone, and along with her all the dreams of the future he wished to share with her. Martha offered to and care for the babies for a few more days, but Spencer knew they were his responsibility now. By the time morning dawned, the day after Christmas, Spencer felt empty and weak. He only had to look at his babies to know he had to find strength. He left Martha with the infants and walked out into the snow-covered field. There he sank down onto his knees and wept. He wept until he had no more tears to cry. When he glanced up at the cloudless sky, it looked as empty as his heart felt. He bowed his head, hoping that somewhere up there God would hear his prayers. "Dear Lord, please take care of my Daisy. She's with you now and suffers no more. Please help me, Lord. Help me raise these babies and make their mama proud. Help me be a good father, one that will always support them, cherish them, and love them. You blessed me with the love of a good woman, Lord. I'll always be grateful for that. Now please give me the strength to be the pa those babies need. Amen." Walking back to the cabin was the hardest thing Spencer had ever done before, because he knew this was no longer a road he would walk with Daisy, but a road he would have to walk alone. Martha was waiting for him in the kitchen. "The babies are asleep. Is there anything I can do for you before I go?" Spencer shook his head. "Go on, Martha. Go be with your family. It's time for me to be with mine. Holly and Nicholas won't give me any trouble. They know their pa has his hands full." Martha's face lit up. "Spencer, you named them for Christmas, didn't you? St. Nicholas and Holly bushes. Daisy would have loved it." Spencer nodded. "She mentioned she would have liked that to be their names if they were born over Christmas time." "Well, it's beautiful." Martha dragged on her coat, scarf, and gloves before touching Spencer's arm. "You'll be all right, you know? You might be the most tired man in all of Black Mountain, but those babies are going to bring you more joy than you've ever known." Spencer shrugged. "I hope so, Martha, because without Daisy, I'm not sure I'll ever be able to find joy again." After Martha left, Spencer went to Holly and Nicholas to see them cradled with each other, fast asleep. His heart swelled with love for his newborn twins just before it shattered again, knowing he'd just lost his wife. Chapter 7. Carol waved as the train pulled out of the station. She was overjoyed for her best friend, even though she felt a little sorry for herself. She watched until the train grew small in the distance before she turned and walked back home. Snowflakes began dancing on the air as she crossed the busier part of town, and although Carol tried not to think about the night she had lost her mother, every year when the snow began to fall, she was taken right back to the brownstone and the room in which her mother had passed away. The first few weeks following the fire had been the worst of Carol's life. She had pawned the golden candle holders, and although she knew she had been cheated, she wasn't in a position to negotiate. The candle holders had barely earned her enough for a month's boarding in a boarding house of ill repute and a few items of clothing. That Christmas had been the worst of her entire life. She had spent her nights mourning her mother and her days searching for employment. Although she had been 17, she had no references and struggled for 6 weeks before finally finding work in the factory from which her mother had escaped. The hours were long, the wages meager, but Carol would always be grateful to the factory because although it had brought her fatigue as she had never known, it had given her Patsy. Carol glanced over her shoulder, hoping that Patsy would find love when she finally got off the train in the West. They had become fast friends between quick breaks and long hours behind the wheel of a sewing machine. A year into their friendship, Patty had suggested they move in together. Not only would they save money, but they would no longer spend their nights mourning the families they had lost. The last 2 years hadn't exactly brought Carol joy, but it had eased the pain. The night the Christmas tree had set the brownstone on fire, her life had taken a different turn, one she would have never imagined it would take. She was left with nothing and no one, and had to carve out a new life for herself. Now her life was taking a new turn again. It had been Patty who came to her with the tale of a girl becoming a mail-order bride. They had laughed over it at first. To them, it seemed a desperate act to travel halfway across the country to marry a man you didn't know. But a few weeks on, Patty had sat Carol down one evening with a firm expression. She had made it clear that New York held no future for them, and unless they took hold of their own future, they would never have one. They had clubbed together and bought a copy of the Matrimonial Times. Some hours later, they had perused the pages of the newspaper until Patty finally announced she had found an advertisement that was of interest. It took a few days before Carol finally gathered the courage to pick an advertisement for herself. Over the last year, they had corresponded with men in the West, men who spoke of themselves as handsome and successful, men who could offer them a better life than the life they had in New York. When a proposal had come in the mail, Carol had been cautious for Patty to accept so eagerly, but Carol knew how quickly life could change and how quickly it could be taken from you. She had supported Patty's decision to travel to Montana to meet her mail-order husband. Now she just hoped Patty would be happy. As for herself, she hadn't yet received a proposal. Michael Savage, the man with whom she had been corresponding, was the owner of a mine and described himself as tall, handsome, and quite charming. Despite working long hours at the factory, whenever she received a letter from Michael, she found herself dreaming of their future again. It might not be the future she had in mind when she was young, but with adulthood had come a good view of reality. Her station in life was worse now than it had been when she had worked for the Smithers, and the chances for an engagement with a man of wealthy means were almost non-existent. So instead, she dreamed of spending her life with Michael Savage in the town called Black Mountain, Colorado. He had not yet proposed, but Carol prayed it was only a matter of time. With Patty gone, the rent would be more, and the nights would be lonely. Last year, she and Patty had bought each other a gift and spent Christmas feasting on cheese and bread, but without Patty, Christmas this year would be cold, lonely, and sad. Christmas brought back the memories of everything she had lost 3 years ago. She pushed the thought aside as she crossed into the borough of East Harlem. Some were starting to call it Spanish Harlem because of the influx of Spanish immigrants who had taken up residency. Spanish could be heard being spoken throughout the area. As much as she felt unwelcome uptown, Carol also felt unwelcome in Spanish Harlem. She kept her head down as she made her way to her apartment. When she arrived, the temperature had dropped, and Carol was eager to stoke the stove for some heat when she noticed a letter that had been slipped underneath the door. Her eyes widened and her heart skipped a beat, even as a smile curved her mouth. It was from Michael. Carol rushed inside and quickly added more logs to the wood stove before taking off her coat and settling with the letter close to the heat. She tore the envelope open and smiled as she recognized Michael's handwriting. "My dearest Carol, I hope this letter finds you warm and healthy. Winter has slowly taken hold of our little valley. You can smell it in the cool air of dawn and see it in the snowflakes that grace my porch. Last night, I glanced up at the sky and wished you were here to share the sight with me. I made a wish on a shooting star, and now it's up to you to make that wish come true. Come to Black Mountain, Carol, to be my wife. We've spent months corresponding, and I feel it is time for us to be married. I will provide a good life for you. I am a man of wealthy means with a claim to my name. I'm hardworking, and I promise not to expect anything from you but to be as charming and kind as you seem in your letters. I know you might be hesitant to accept a proposal from a man you've never met, but I hope you'll understand I'm taking a leap of faith as well. All I know about you is what you've told me, and I trust that you were truthful in your letters. It's time for us to start our lives together, my dearest Carol. It's time for us to be married and have a family. This Christmas, I want to share the festive season with someone I love. I know the sadness the Christmas season brings for you, and I want to be the one who chases those grievous shadows from your eyes. I have enclosed with this letter a money order to cover your train fare west, as well as some funds for any incidentals or items you might need for the journey. As soon as I receive a wire confirming your arrival, I will start preparing for our wedding and our first Christmas together. Until I hear from you, you have my heart and my fondest wishes. Yours truly, Michael Savage." Carol clutched the letter to her heart as a smile curved the corners of her mouth. Perhaps she wouldn't be spending Christmas on her own after all. She hadn't expected Michael to propose so soon, but she didn't even need time to consider his proposal. She was saying yes. He had described himself as tall, with light honey-colored hair and a charming smile. He was the owner of a mine and claimed to be hardworking and kind. It might not be the true love Carol had dreamed of as a young girl, but it was the best option for her future. Carol couldn't help but wonder if her mother would have approved. She thought for a moment before she knew for certain that her mother would have been cheering her on. She was taking charge of her life. She was taking charge of her future happiness. And a woman who had the courage to do that was one her mother would have been proud of. Carol rushed to the writing desk and quickly pulled out a nib and a sheet of paper. By candlelight, she accepted Michael's proposal before she began making a list. She would wire him her arrival date in the morning, but first she needed to prepare for a journey like the one her friend had just undertaken. Before she went to bed, she wrote a letter to Patty telling her the news. She knew her friend would only receive the letter after she left New York, and as such asked her to wait before she replied until Carol sent word of her new mailing address in Black Mountain, Colorado. Chapter 8. Carol was tired, dirty, and relieved as she disembarked from the train in the small town of Black Mountain. The train had been due to arrive 5 days ago, but they had been delayed by technical problems. After days of traveling and stopping and traveling just to break down again, she had never been more relieved than to put her feet on solid ground. The journey had been troubled, but also uncomfortable. Although the rail company promoted this as the most luxurious train in the United States, she wasn't sure any of those proposing such luxury had personally sat in the tiny seats for going on 3 weeks. There was a cold wind howling as she wrapped her coat tighter around her waist. Her gaze drifted towards the thoroughfare, and a smile curved her mouth. It was Christmas Eve, and although she wasn't yet in the Christmas spirit, the sight of the decorated shop fronts lifted her spirits instantly. Not only would she be meeting Michael Savage on Christmas Eve, she would also be marrying him. Her heart fluttered at the thought of becoming Mrs. Savage, even as she scanned the platform for a man of his description. When a short man with a paunch approached her, she thought it might be his driver, until he held out a pudgy hand and offered her a smile short of a good many teeth. Miss Arthur's? Michael Savage at your service. Carol tried to hide her surprise at the overweight, middle-aged man before her. He looked nothing like the tall, blond man he had described himself to be in the letters. Instead of a charming smile, he had more teeth missing than present. He smelt of liquor, and the buttons at his waist were stretched to within an inch of their capability. Carol almost covered her eyes to protect them in the likelihood that any one of the buttons flew off. She swallowed past the horror that washed over her as she narrowed her gaze. "You are Michael Savage?" He laughed robustly. "I know I'm much more charming in person, aren't I? It's a delight to meet you, Carol. I must say you underplayed your beauty in your letters." Carol smiled hesitantly, uncertain of what she should do. The man before her was closer to 50 than the 30 he led her to believe he was. Judging by the state of his clothes and the state of his scuffed boots, she immediately wondered if he did in fact own a mine or whether he only worked in one. She had been fooled in the worst possible way. Michael Savage was nothing of the man he claimed to be. The town seemed charming, but the man before her was nothing more than a ruthless liar who had tricked her into coming to the West to be his mail-order bride. "You must be tired after your travels. Let's get this over with, and then I can take you home to rest." Carol's heart jumped into her throat, making speech difficult. "The ceremony is now. I hoped to bathe first." She glanced back, considering jumping back onto the train, but just then, the wheels started to move and it pulled out of the station. "It's Christmas Eve, my dear. The preacher is already doing us a favor by offering to wed us now instead of after Christmas. Surely you don't want your reputation ruined by spending a few nights in my home without a chaperone." Carol thought of her mother's warning about a woman's reputation and found herself nodding. "Of course, I understand." "Good, good. Grab your luggage and we can be on our way," Michael said before he turned and started towards a wagon waiting a short distance from the platform. For a moment, Carol thought he was kidding and would return to help her with her luggage. She waited until she watched him climb into the wagon before he turned to her with a foolish grin. "Come on now, preacher ain't got all day." Just like that, Carol knew her life had indeed taken another turn. Sent. Instead of the good turn she had hoped for, it had taken a turn for the worst. Once she had struggled her trunk onto the wagon, she climbed up beside Michael. "The chapel is just at the end of the thoroughfare. As soon as we're married, we can head home. I haven't had much time to clean, and I'm sure you'll want to cook us something for Christmas Eve as well." Carol looked at him in shock and horror. She had just traveled for 3 weeks, and he expected her to cook and clean immediately on her arrival. Her hopes sank into the mud below the wagon's wheels, realizing Michael Savage didn't want a wife or a mother for his future children. Michael Savage wanted a slave. A workhorse he didn't have to pay. With no other choice, she followed him into the chapel a few moments later. The preacher was in a hurry to get home and didn't even bother with a short sermon. His words were brisk and heartless, and when he turned to Carol, she took her vows with tears pooling in her eyes. Chapter 9. On Christmas morning, Carol woke up in the small room at the back of Michael's house. She was grateful to have her own room, but couldn't help but be reminded of the servants' room she had shared with her mother while working for the Smithers. It wasn't that she was ungrateful, she was just disillusioned. From Michael's letters, she had imagined him a completely different man to the man she had come to know since her arrival in Black Mountain the day before. He looked nothing like the man he had described in his letters, and although Carol hadn't been searching for wealth, it was clear on arrival at his ramshackle home that Michael only dreamed of wealth. Instead of taking the bath she had so desperately dreamed of the last few days, Michael expected her to clean the cabin and cook him a meal for Christmas Eve. She only managed to fall into bed after midnight, exhausted and emotional. The entire evening, Michael had barely spoken 2 words to her, except when they had sat down for dinner. He had briefly welcomed her before asking her to be up before him in the morning. It would be Christmas morning, and he expected a sturdy breakfast to hold him until Christmas dinner, which he expected to be something special. She had tossed and turned the entire night thinking about Patty. Had Patty suffered the same fate on her arrival in Montana, or had she been lucky enough to correspond with an honest man? Some would have cursed and cried out in frustration, but Carol had prayed instead for patience and strength. This morning, she was up before dawn. After making her bed and putting on one of her better dresses, she set to work in the kitchen. It was almost 2 hours before Michael finally arose. He walked into the kitchen, giving the shelves one look before turning to her with a cocked brow. "I thought I told you the house needed a cleaning?" Carol's jaw dropped with indignation, but she shut her mouth before saying anything that might earn her more ruthless treatment than his cruel words. I I was tired from the journey, Michael. I'll make sure I get to it today." "Good. A wife needs to know her place in the house at all times," Michael added, taking a seat at the table. "Coffee, 3 sugars." Carol scurried around the kitchen, filling his cup to the brim and stirring in the sugar before she set it down in front of him. He reminded her so much of Mr. Smithers that she very nearly took her plate outside. After plating sausages, eggs, and biscuits, she took both plates to the table and took a seat. "This'll do," Michael grunted as he began shoveling the food into his mouth. Within seconds, Carol lost her appetite completely. When she didn't touch her plate, he glanced at her with a cocked brow. "You gonna eat that?" Carol hesitated before she pushed the plate towards him. Within a few minutes, that plate was empty as well. He sat back and rubbed a hand over his large belly. "Now that we have a minute, I think it's time we spoke about your duties." Carol frowned. "My duties? As a wife." A quiver of fear traveled down her spine. She had known there would be duties she would need to take up as a wife, but now she was terrified. "Firstly, the house is a pigsty. I expect you to clean it properly. I don't want to see a speck of dust or a grain of dirt. Understood?" Carol nodded, trying to still her racing heart. "Of course." "Good. I work long hours to provide for us, so I expect you to be kind and attentive when I arrive home from the mine in the evenings. Working in a mine is hard work, and a man can't be expected to take up housekeeping duties when he's done for the day." Michael paused to take a sip of his coffee. "You need to take care of the house. I don't expect you to fix the roof if it springs a leak, but I do expect you to know how to wield a hammer if a nail comes loose." I'll learn." "Yes'm, you will," Michael said firmly. "There's a cow in the barn and 2 horses, along with a few chickens in the coop. They're in there for winter, but in spring we turn them out, except for the chickens, of course. They need to be fed and watered morning and eve. I won't take kindly to losing livestock because my wife is incapable." Carol sat and listened as he continued, realizing that Michael was laying down the proverbial law. He had indeed wanted a wife, but only because he didn't need to pay her a wage. What Michael Savage truly wanted was a slave. He wanted someone to do his bidding, cooking and cleaning, without asking a question or expecting a dime in return. She listened as her responsibilities were listed to her one by one. Apart from everything in and around the house, she was to take care of a kitchen garden, spring through autumn as well. Carol had never carried out any maintenance or grown anything from seed, but she had a feeling that if she didn't do as she was told, Michael might become even meaner than the beady-eyed man sitting across from her. When he was finally finished, he let out a heavy sigh. "I'm exhausted. I'm going to put up my feet for a while by the fire." "Why don't you get started? Them animals in the barn are waiting for their breakfast." Carol nodded and stood up, gathering their plates. She felt completely numbed by what she just learned. She might have come to Colorado with dreams of a better life, but suddenly she wondered whether the tenement apartment and her job in the factory were not a better alternative. For a moment, she considered returning to New York, but even if she wanted to, she had no money for the train fare. As she acquainted herself with the cow, horses, and chickens, she wept for the turn her life had just taken. It was supposed to be Christmas, a Christmas with gifts and a tree. Instead, it was the first day of her life sentence as Michael Savage's maid and slave. Chapter 10. Spencer felt his heart swell in his chest as he watched Holly and Nicholas play on the rug by the fire. He sipped on his coffee and wished that Daisy could have seen them now. They were turning 2 today, and Spencer had tried his best to make the day special for them. Although they didn't have a mother, the entire town had helped Spencer over the last 2 years. A group of ladies made turns looking after them, and although Spencer was grateful for everyone's help and concern, he couldn't help but wish they had a more stable mother figure in their lives. Christmas had always been a special time of year for Spencer and Daisy. It had been a day of cuddling by the fire, opening gifts, and celebrating the occasion with a feast. There would be no cuddling for Spencer with the woman he loved. But there were gifts, and later he would spoil the twins with their favorite meal for supper. The last 3 years had been a roller coaster of diapers, feedings, and nighttime tantrums. Spencer had never been more exhausted in his entire life, but he was also proud. When Daisy passed away, he had known that it was going to be hard. He hadn't the first clue about how to manage 2 twins and a ranch, but somehow he had found the strength and the will. The twins were growing like weeds, and fortunately for Spencer, they entertained each other more frequently these days. He actually managed to finish a cup of coffee before it went completely cold. He chuckled as Holly wrestled her brother to the floor, but when Nicholas began to fuss, he went over to soothe them. "Time for gifts," Spencer said, pointing to the tree. He hadn't been sure what to buy for his twins for Christmas. Gifts had always been Daisy's department. But Spencer vowed to honor her dying wish to make sure Christmas was special for the twins, not to let her death ruin the holiday or their birthdays for them. Spencer tried his best to focus on the day, but every now and then he would remember Daisy, and it would feel as if his heart was breaking all over again. She had asked him to open his heart to love again, but Spencer knew that would never be possible. Daisy had been his everything. She had been his light in the dark and his laughter during the hard times. She had been his voice of reason and the beat of his heart. Spencer only carried on for the twins, but late at night, when they were fast asleep, Spencer would feel loneliness suffocate him. He would miss her as if he had just lost her moments ago. Whenever the twins learned something new, he wanted to tell her. The twins toddled to the tree and began inspecting the gifts Spencer had put there the night before. "That one's yours, Holly," he pointed to a small gift. Holly giggled as she tore off the wrapping. "It's a bear!" Spencer couldn't help but laugh as she clutched the bear to her chest with a smile a mile wide. "I think he needs a name, don't you?" Holly nodded. "Bear!" Spencer chuckled as he reached for a bigger gift and offered it to Nicholas. "This one is yours." Nicholas's Jun eyes brightened, and he reminded Spencer so much of Daisy. He wasn't as outgoing as Holly, but his eyes could speak volumes without uttering a single word. Nicholas opened the gift and gasped before looking to Spencer to confirm it was indeed his. "That's right, buddy. Merry Christmas." The toy train had been on the shelf in the mercantile for months. Every time Spencer stopped by, Nicholas would point to it and babble incoherently about the twain. Spencer took the remaining gifts and divided them between the twins. There were crayons, paper, candy, and clothes. He had made sure they were spoiled today, just like Daisy would have wanted him to. "Your gift, Pa?" Holly asked, glancing back at the tree. Spencer shook his head before scooping Holly up. "You're my gift. Both of you." "Do you want to hear the story about when I got you for Christmas?" Nicholas nodded eagerly and scooched closer. Spencer had begun telling the story last Christmas. It still hurt, but he knew that for the sake of his children, he needed to talk about Daisy. They needed to know how brave their mother had been and how special she was. 2 years ago, your ma and I prayed for a gift from God, a gift so special you couldn't put it under a tree or buy it in a store, a gift so wonderful that you could only get it from God. God blessed us with our dream, and your ma's belly began to grow. It grew and grew and grew until we were sure she was going to float away like a balloon. Nicholas and Holly giggled at the image Spencer painted with his words. On Christmas Eve, we put up the tree, but we didn't have any gifts. The only gift we had under the tree was a crib, because we knew that if God granted our gift, we would need one. Holly nodded. She had taken to putting her dolls in the crib just like any other little girl. That night, God sent us the most amazing gifts ever. He didn't send us just one baby. He sent us 2, the 2 of you. Spencer touched their noses and bit back the tears that clogged his throat. You were both absolutely perfect, a perfect pair. I'm not a pair, Nicholas huffed. Spencer chuckled. A pair means two, and your ma and I were blessed with the two of you. Tell the rest, Pa, Holly urged, holding her bear close. The following day, your ma was so happy that we were blessed with you. She was so happy and loved you so much, she wanted to go thank the Lord herself. Spencer drew in a deep breath before he continued to the hardest part of the story. And then she liked heaven so much that she stayed there to always watch over us. Now that your ma is an angel, you might not see her, but she's always right here. Spencer put his hand over his heart. One day when God calls us home, we'll see her again. She'll be waiting in the home she's preparing for us while we're still down here. Holly hugged her bear. Mama's an angel. That's right, baby girl. Spencer nodded, ruffling her hair. The story seemed to make the twins happy, and although it hurt to tell it, Spencer knew they needed to remember their mother, and they needed to know how much she loved them. Knowing he needed a moment alone without the twins seeing the tears shining in his eyes, he stood up and clapped his hands. Why don't you open the rest of your gifts and I'll make us pancakes for breakfast? Christmas pancakes, Nicholas cried out with glee. Chapter 11. Carol walked to work in the snow. A blisteringly cold wind was blowing, and she wished she could curl up by the fire instead, but there would be no mercy for her, at least not today. A sigh escaped her, realizing that Christmas had not only become a time of mourning for her, but a time of dread. The holiday she had so looked forward to as a young girl had become her most dreaded time of year. While everyone was preparing their Christmas feasts, Carol was on her way to work. A few months after her arrival in Black Mountain, Michael had come home one morning in a temper. Carol would never forget that morning. It had been the first morning he raised his hand to her. It had also been the morning he told her he was done caring for her, and that it was her turn to pick up the slack. Carol couldn't imagine working harder than she already did, but she could read between the lines. Michael had lost his job at the mine, and she needed to find work to keep them fed. It had taken her a week, during which she had suffered every night that she arrived home without news of a job on the horizon. Finally, Mrs. Jones, the owner of the mercantile store in Black Mountain, had taken pity on the bruised and desperate woman begging for work. Carol had known that Mrs. Jones didn't need help, but she had been working at the mercantile ever since. Over and above the duties Michael expected her to do at home, she now worked an 8-hour shift at the mercantile every day. She didn't mind the hard work at all, because her time spent at the mercantile was time away from Michael. In her mind, she had come to think of him as savage, savage by name, savage by nature. After he had lost his job in the mine, he had taken up drinking as his favorite pastime. Not only was her husband a lazy louse, but the liquor made him a mean one. The one time Carol planned on escaping back to New York by putting some of her wages secretly aside, Michael had found out. Carol could still remember how it felt having to get through the chores while nursing 3 cracked ribs. She never tried again. Once or twice she considered asking Mrs. Jones for help, but Mrs. Jones had a blind husband in a wheelchair. She had enough troubles of her own without adding to it. Instead, Carol kept her head down and did what was expected. At least if Michael had nothing to complain about, he didn't have a reason to beat her. Carol knew that if he wasn't home when she arrived, she had very little time to cook dinner and clean the house. Nothing angered her beloved husband more than arriving home after a drinking binge to an empty table and a dusty house. What Michael didn't know was that Carol retired to bed early each night, only to wake up after midnight to clean the house while he slept. Avoidance had become a skill Carol never knew she would hone, but it was one she now cherished more than any other. The thoroughfare was buzzing with activity when she arrived in town. It was Christmas Eve, and everyone was stocking up for what they would need, as well as last-minute gifts. Carol knew most of the people in town from working at the mercantile. Although she had no friends, she waved to anyone who acknowledged her. By the time she arrived at the mercantile, Mrs. Jones was already behind the counter. "Good morning, Carol. Lovely day for Christmas Eve, isn't it? Hopefully, the weather will hold until after Christmas. The last thing we need today is snow. Bad for business. Carol smiled. Merry Christmas, Mrs. Jones. She reached into her purse and took out a small gift which she handed to her employer. It's not much, but I'd like you to have it. Mrs. Jones gasped in surprise as she opened the gift. Carol had dried a posy of flowers in the spring and scented it with scented oil. Carol, these are beautiful. You can put them in a drawer to keep the laundry smelling fresh, Carol added, remembering how the housekeeper had always done so for the Smithers. What a lovely idea! Mrs. Jones let out a heavy sigh. I know it's none of my business, Carol, but I so wish you hadn't married that horrible savage. You deserve someone kind and caring, someone who won't work you like a dog. It was the first time Mrs. Jones made any mention of Carol's husband. She was a little caught off guard by the comment and merely shrugged. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said anything, Mrs. Jones smiled apologetically. Carol sighed. It's all right. He wouldn't have been my first choice either if I'd known the truth, but unfortunately Michael wasn't very truthful in his letters to me. You poor dear, you deserve more. Someone like him. Mrs. Jones cocked a brow as the door opened and the bells jingled. Carol's face lit up with a smile as the twins rushed into the mercantile. Although she didn't know Mr. Boardman personally, she simply adored his children. At 4 years old, they were bundles of energy who could bring life to any room. Carol had been very careful not to get acquainted with anyone because she didn't want to chance Michael's jealousy. Merry Christmas, Mr. Boardman greeted as he walked into the mercantile with a bright smile. Carol's heart skipped a beat when he looked directly at her with piercing blue eyes. His hair was the color of coal dust and his eyes friendly as he smiled at her. Carol couldn't help but consider how his wife had been blessed with such a nice man. Although she didn't know him personally, Carol could see how he was with his children. Mr. Boardman was a kind man, the type of man she would have chosen to marry. Merry Christmas to you too, Spencer. I have to check on something in the back, Mrs. Jones said before winking at Carol and heading to the back room. For a moment, Carol was frozen to the spot. What was Mrs. Jones thinking? Not only was she married to Michael Savage, but Spencer Boardman was married himself, with children to boot. It's our birthday, the little girl announced, tugging on Carol's dress. Carol felt a smile lift the corners of her mouth, even as her heart swelled in her chest. She had always dreamed of having children, and now knew she never would. She was grateful that Michael had never called her on her physical duties as a wife, and hopefully never would. But deep down, Carol wished to have a beautiful little girl. She also wanted a kind husband to go with that beautiful girl. She pushed the thoughts aside and walked over to the jar of marshmallows. A birthday girl deserves a treat. Carol took 2 marshmallows out and offered them to the children before she turned to their father. How can I help you today, Mr. Boardman? Chapter 12. It had been 4 years since Spencer had lost his wife. 4 years of having barely any time to himself between working the ranch and raising the twins. He had never given much thought to Daisy's wish for him to find love again, but as Carol handed the candy to the children, he couldn't help but wonder if he was denying them good fortune by not finding them a mother. He looked up and smiled at the shop assistant. She was a very pretty girl in her early 20s, if Spencer had to guess. He didn't know much about her apart from what he'd heard around town. Carol was from New York and was unfortunate enough to have married Michael Savage. Everyone knew that Savage had been laid off by the mine because he was too lazy and too irresponsible to be trusted. In a mine, no one wanted to work with someone that couldn't be trusted. Spencer couldn't help but be curious as to what Carol had seen in Savage. He shoved the thoughts aside. It was none of his business. We need a few things for our Christmas dinner. And Christmas pancakes, Nicholas added. We need honey or syrup, Pa. Spencer chuckled. Of course you do. He turned to Carol, mentally reciting the list of what he needed. First, we need a roast. I asked Mrs. Jones to hold one for me. Carol nodded. Yes, I'll fetch it for you. She scurried away and returned a few seconds later with a large roast. Anything else? Flour, potatoes, onions, candles, matches, sugar, and of course we can't forget the syrup, Or honey if you don't have syrup, Spencer finished. Carol smiled. Seems like your wife is cooking quite the feast for Christmas. Spencer glanced at the children who were admiring the toys on the shelf, making sure they weren't close before he corrected Carol. My wife passed. Oh, Carol said, surprised. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to. It's fine, Spencer smiled. It's been 4 years. Today, actually. Carol's brow creased as she searched his face. That must have been terribly hard. On their birthday, the birth, she quickly shook her head. Just ignore me, I'm being rude. Spencer smiled kindly. It's natural to ask. It's a difficult time of year for me, but Daisy would have wanted me to make it special for the twins. Christmas and birthdays seem like a busy time of year. Yup, Spencer chuckled. And every year I believe I'm going to get the roast right this time. I haven't managed yet, but it's tradition, so I keep trying. Spencer smiled and shook his head. Got any advice? Carol laughed softly. It's not that hard. You just have to make sure the oven is neither too hot nor too cold. My mother used to be a cook for an English family. She always said if you can hold your hand in the over and count to 20 before pulling away, it's the right heat. Really? I'll try that. How long do you roast it for? Spencer asked, feeling a little intrigued by Carol Savage. He'd always knew her accent wasn't local, but now it made sense. 4 hours. Just keep an eye on it, Carol said as she began adding up the items. I will. Thank you. Hopefully this year they'll be able to eat it. Carol chuckled. I'm sure it's not that bad. Nicholas suddenly appeared at his side. Last Christmas Pa had to throw out the roast. He said it was harder than a rock and tougher too. Carol laughed. I gave your Pa some pointers, so you be sure to come and tell me how it tasted. Nicholas' head bobbed up and down. I will, miss, promise. Spencer was a little surprised at how comfortable Nicholas was with Carol. Usually his son was quiet and his daughter couldn't stop talking. He handed over the money and smiled. Thank you, Mrs. Savage. Spencer couldn't help but notice her flinch as he said her name. He was sure he had got it right, so he wasn't sure what had offended her. Before Spencer could apologize, the door to the mercantile burst open and a man rushed inside. Come quick. There's been an accident. Spencer instantly reached for the twins' hands as Carol rushed around the counter. They stepped out onto the boardwalk bordering the stores, only to see a crowd gathering at the saloon. What's happened? Spencer asked a spectator. Savage. He's been at the saloon all night, drunk as a skunk, stumbled into the thoroughfare just as the stagecoach raced into town. Did he make it? Spencer asked, struggling to see through the gathering crowd. The man shook his head. Nope, he's a goner. Beside him, Spencer heard Carol gasp. He turned to look at her with concern. He might never have been fond of Michael Savage, but he had been Carol's husband. Are you all right? Carol shook her head. When I didn't see him this morning, I thought he was sleeping. 1,000 thoughts circled Spencer's mind at the confusion on Carol's face. Why didn't she share a room with her husband? And more importantly, why was she not upset at the news of her husband's demise? Chapter 13. Carol couldn't stop the smile that curved her mouth as she set the blue jug filled with sunflowers on the kitchen table. Laughter bubbled from her throat at how it brightened the entire room. She might not have found love, but in her way she was beginning to find joy in Black Mountain. Michael Savage brought her to this town of misfits, miners, and families seeking better lives in the West. He had never brought her any joy or thanked her for working for him as his slave, but Carol didn't need his appreciation. Being married to Michael Savage had been the hardest time of her entire life. If she had thought that avoiding Mr. Smithers had been hard, she now knew that avoiding Savage's fists had been much harder. He had been nothing like the man he had described in his letters. For a long time, she blamed him for his lies and came very close to hating his mean nature. But in the months since his passing, Carol had almost come to forgive him and had become grateful to him for bringing her here. The morning she had stood on the boardwalk outside the mercantile, watching the crowd gather around his body, she had been mortified at the relief that washed over her. For weeks, she had to pretend to be a grieving widow, while she had been quietly grateful that she no longer had to go home to such a mean drunk. Mrs. Jones was the only person who knew how she felt. although they never spoke about it. Michael had left her nothing but scars and the cabin she now called home. When the winter receded and spring brought with it the blooms of summer and the scent of wildflowers, Carol had donated all Michael's personal possessions to the church. Instead of planting the dreaded kitchen garden, he demanded she plant every spring. She had planted beautiful flowers. Dozens and dozens of sunflowers had graced the patch beside her kitchen for the last few months. Carol had planted them as a reminder that she could still find joy. She loved her job at the mercantile, and although she didn't have a family or a kind and generous husband to care for her, she no longer suffered as she had in New York, and then from Michael's fists. She had joined the small congregation in town and now spent her days off praising the Lord for giving her a home and a second chance. Carol had given up on love and dreams of a family, but late at night when the crickets sang and the stars shone, she allowed herself to revisit those dreams. Fear would drown them out every time. The one time in her life Carol had taken a chance on love, she had become a slave. She vowed she would never be a slave to anyone again. Whether it be as a housemaid, a factory worker, or a wife to a drunken miner, she'd rather be alone and happy than have someone and be miserable. Carol had learned to cook for one person. She had learned to stretch her wages enough that having a kitchen garden no longer made sense, especially since she didn't really have the time to tend it. Carol had learned to be content with her own company and to appreciate the kindness of the townsfolk. Although she had yet to make friends, she didn't let it bother her too much. All the women her age were married with young children to care for. Not only did they not have time to build a friendship with a widow, Carol had a feeling they also didn't want a young widow around their husbands. She opened the windows to let the night air blow out before grabbing her purse and walking to town. There were pumpkins ready for picking in vegetable patches and young horses and cattle playing in the fields. Autumn had come to be her favorite time of year. It wasn't too hot and it wasn't too cold. It was a time of year during which she could just be. A time of year when she didn't have to think about the lonely Christmas that lay ahead or the new year that might bring more heartache. As she walked, Carol wished her mother could see her now. Would her mother be proud of the woman she had become, or would her mother be disappointed that she lived alone? Carol felt a smile curve her mouth, knowing that her mother would understand. Her mother had given up on love after her father passed away. She wouldn't blame Carol for doing the same. At least she was happy. Carol's heart dropped when she saw a mother hanging out her laundry with a baby on her hip. She knew babies were hard work, and although Carol knew that children would probably never grace her future, she still secretly yearned for them. She took pleasure in helping the town's children whenever they came into the mercantile. But there was a big difference between serving children and talking to them and having them to call your own. A sigh escaped her as she pushed the thought aside. She glanced up at the cloudless sky and said a prayer of thanks for everything she did have. She had a home, she had a full belly, a new dress, and sunflowers in her kitchen. It might not have been what she dreamed of as a young girl, but it was more blessings than most. Carol waved at the barber and his wife as they opened the barber shop with a smile. She rounded the corner onto Main Street, where she caught sight of Mrs. Thomas, and her heart clenched in her chest. Just a month ago, Mr. Thomas succumbed after a long fever. Carol had attended the funeral along with the rest of the town. She had stood by Mr. Thomas's grave, feeling guilt overwhelm her as she watched his wife grieve. She couldn't help but feel horrible for not grieving Michael's death. She had taken her vows with him in the eyes of the Lord, and yet she had never felt even a nudge of affection for him. Just like she had been nothing to him but a housekeeper, a cook, and someone to slam around when he was drunk, he had been nothing to her. He had been the man who had brought her to Black Mountain, but he hadn't brought her any joy. How could she have grieved someone she didn't love, someone who brought her nothing but pain and sadness? She managed to let go of that guilt most of the time, but every now and then it would slam into her chest with such force that she could hardly breathe, as it did now. She quickly looked away from Mrs. Thomas, not wanting the elderly lady to see the anxious expression on her face. She should have grieved for her husband, as Mrs. Thomas was still grieving, and yet she had breathed a sigh of relief after his funeral. Would God blame her for not grieving her husband? She remembered how her mother had grieved after her father passed away. She remembered the tears in the dark of night, the swollen eyes in the morning. Carol hadn't once cried for Michael, although she had cried with relief when she learned the cabin would now be hers. Carol drew in a sharp breath as she arrived at the mercantile. It was time to push her personal worries aside and to find a smile for the day's customers. Her heart ached for Mrs. Thomas, but Carol knew she would never grieve Michael's death. There might have been a time when he had been the man he described in the letters he had used to lure her on the train. But the man she had known had been mean, lazy, and selfish. She couldn't mourn not having to spend her evenings with him. She couldn't mourn not having to clean in the hours after midnight for fear of his fist, and she wouldn't mourn moving on. She might not have found love, but she did find peace in her loneliness. Chapter 14. As fall came to an end, Spencer couldn't help but be grateful. Not only for the cooler weather, but because it meant the work became a little less on the ranch. The twins were already 5 years old, and although Spencer allowed them to help out whenever they could, even they needed some time to wind down after the summer. He shifted his hat on his head as walked into the town. The twins had spent the day with the preacher's wife, so Spencer could ride the fences. Although he had brought them into town earlier that morning, he already missed them. He couldn't imagine his life without them. Holly was outgoing and talkative, whereas Nicholas's quiet curiosity reminded him so much of himself at that age. Spencer tipped his hat in greeting to the schoolmarm before he quickly looked away. For the last 2 years, the schoolmarm had been overly friendly to him. Had his children been her students, he would have understood and appreciated her friendliness, but Spencer knew better than to think her interest was in the twins. It had been 5 years since he lost Daisy, and he had never again met anyone who made him take a second look. Even as the thought crossed his mind, he glanced towards the mercantile. His heart skipped a beat when Carol stepped outside to sweep the porch at that very moment. Last Christmas, in the moments after Michael Savage had been killed by the stagecoach, Spencer had been ready to offer her any support she needed. But when he turned to console her, she had been as stiff as a board, frozen to the spot. In the 10 months since then, Spencer's curiosity over Michael's widow had only increased. Whereas other women might mourn or head back east, Carol had settled right in at Black Mountain and seemed almost content. She was unlike any woman he had ever met. She had a kindness about her that appealed to his children whenever they were in town, and yet there was a quiet strength about her that intrigued him. Spencer would never admit that his frequent trips to the mercantile had more to do with wanting to see Carol than forgetting to buy an item the day before. In his mind, he wasn't ready to even consider love again, but that didn't explain why his heart skipped a beat every time he saw Carol. He cleared his throat and found his feet moving towards the mercantile. It was as if she drew him in, without saying a word or even looking at him, and Spencer wanted to be closer to her. She always smelled of flowers, even in the winter, a scent Spencer had come to associate with her. Spencer didn't know much about her past or why she had traveled to Black Mountain to become Michael's bride, but he found himself wanting to know more. "Good day, Mr. Boardman." Carol waved with a smile as she caught sight of him approaching. Spencer's heart skipped a beat as she set the broom aside. "How can we help today?" Spencer smiled a little awkwardly. "Mrs. Savage, don't you think we know each other well enough to address each other on a first-name basis?" Carol chuckled. "Mr. Boardman, I know nothing about you except that you have the most adorable twins I've ever met." Spencer shrugged. "Even so, please, call me Spencer." Carol smiled and searched his gaze for a moment, as if debating whether or not she liked the idea. "All right, Spencer, please call me Carol." Spencer felt his heart lift, and for a moment he was surprised by the effect her smile had on him. It had been such a long time that he considered his own feelings rather than those of his children that for a moment he could do nothing but stare. "Was there something you needed?" Carol asked, interrupting his thoughts. Spencer quickly nodded and named the first item that came to mind. Salt. I need salt. I completely forgot about getting some when I stopped by yesterday. Carol laughed, shaking her head. Spencer, are you out on that ranch growing cattle or curing beef? You bought an ounce of salt just a few days ago. Spencer could kick himself for not remembering. He laughed a little, nervously. He couldn't remember ever being this nervous around Daisy. But then when he became interested in Daisy, he was young and foolish and felt as if he had the world at his feet. Now he had loved and lost and was a little rusty. The twins spilled it all. Had to toss it away, Spencer said easily, hoping his children would one day forgive him for the white lie. Spencer, a pleasure to see you again, Mrs. Jones called out as she came in from the back. Spencer waved, feeling a blush color his cheeks. He was definitely out of practice. Carol handed him the salt. Don't let the twins see it. Spencer frowned for a moment, thinking she was talking about the blush that had settled beneath his beard before he realized she meant the salt. The salt, right? That will be 50 cents, Carol said with a smile. He handed her the money and waved to Mrs. Jones. You ladies have a good day now. He walked out of the mercantile feeling foolish and confused. Until that moment, he hadn't realized why he kept visiting the mercantile when he didn't need anything. But just now, when Carol had smiled at him, Spencer realized for the first time that he liked her. He liked her in the same way he had liked Daisy before they had courted. He was both surprised and baffled at the thought. Daisy's dying wish was for him to find a mother for their twins and to open his heart to love again. He never thought he'd want to honor that wish. Until now. He briskly made his way to fetch the twins, and soon they were all headed back to the ranch. On arrival, he took out the salt and put it on the table, making Holly frown. Pa, didn't you just buy salt the other day? Spencer cringed, remembering Carol's words. Perhaps he should have hidden it from the children after all. We did, but I need more. The twins rushed outside to play in the fading light while Spencer prepared dinner. As he cooked, he couldn't stop himself from thinking about Carol. She had been in town for almost 2 years now, and never before had Spencer ever thought of her in the way he had today. Her laughter sounded in his mind, and for a moment he imagined what it would feel like to have a woman around again. The sweet sound of her voice in the morning, sharing coffee on the porch, dreaming of the future. His thoughts trailed off at the sight of the blanket that hung over the sofa. The blanket Daisy had knitted for him the winter after they were married. He was suddenly overwhelmed with such a sense of loss that he shoved all thoughts of Carol aside. He had loved Daisy with everything inside him. He couldn't love like that again. Daisy wanted him to open his heart to love again, but what she didn't know was that she had taken it with her to heaven. His interest in Carol was a passing infatuation, nothing more. In a week or maybe a month, he would have forgotten all about Carol Savage. He had to because he couldn't love another woman as he loved Daisy, and loving any woman less would be sacrilege. Chapter 15. Carol watched Spencer leave the mercantile with a frown etched between her brows. Usually, Spencer Boardman was such an organized and friendly man. It wasn't that he hadn't been friendly today. He had just been different. It was as if he was stumbling over his words like his 5-year-old twins. She shook her head and turned around to find Mrs. Jones watching her with a cocked brow and her hands braced on her hips. That man ain't coming in here for no salt, I tell ya. She chuckled, shaking her head. Carol's frown deepened. But that's what he bought? That's what he bought simply because he needed a reason to come in here and talk to ya. Carol, I've been watching the both of you being as dim-witted about this as 2 mules over a pound of gold, and I think Spencer just realized its worth. Carol let out a sigh. I'm sorry, Mrs. Jones. I don't follow you at all. He's been a widower for going on 5 years, and I think Spencer Boardman just realized his future was standing right in front of him. I've known him most of his life, and I ain't never seen him mumbling and fumbling over his words. By heavens, that man blushed the color of ripe tomato beneath that beard. If you'd known him long enough, you would have noticed. Mrs. Jones laughed as she walked towards Carol. Don't tell me you didn't notice he's sweet on you. Savage has been in the ground for almost a year. No one would cock a brow if you decided 'twas time to move on. Realization struck Carol like a brisk Arctic storm. You think? She turned and watched Spencer's brisk pace take him further and further down the main street. You think he likes me? I think he likes you a whole bit, and he dunno what to do about it. I've seen the way you smile at him. You might be friendly to all our clientele, but you're especially fond of Spencer and his twins. Carol shook her head, unable to fathom that a kind and sweet man like Spencer Boardman would be sweet on her. I don't know, Mrs. Jones. Perhaps you're mistaken. Mrs. Jones laughed as she turned and headed back towards the back room. Just like I'm mistaken that there ain't no more salt on the shelf. If Spencer keeps this up, he'll need a bigger pantry. Her laughter drifted off as Carol turned and saw that there was indeed no more salt left on the shelf. She drew in a sharp breath, wondering if Mrs. Jones was right. Spencer had been coming into the mercantile more often of late, but she thought nothing of it. Until now. She racked her brain trying to remember Spencer's buying habits from long ago, and remembered that he usually only came in twice a week to buy whatever items he needed. Over the last week, he had stopped by on most days. From what she had heard, he lived a little way out of town, which would mean stopping by the mercantile didn't happen by chance. As she adjusted the items on the shelf to close the open gap, she found herself wondering how she felt about Spencer being keen on her. A smile lifted the corners of her mouth as she felt her heart begin to swell in her chest. Ever since she had stood over Michael's grave, she had never allowed herself to think of love or family again. But now she couldn't help but wonder if she might still have a chance. She might be 22 years old, an age at which most girls were already wed, but just maybe God had something in mind for her after all. The rest of the day she worked with a smile constantly gracing her face. When it was time to leave for home, she walked with a skip in her step. The sun was sinking a little earlier every evening, a warning of the colder months that were coming. It had never bothered Carol before now. For a moment she was taken back to all the winters before. All the loss, the pain, and hardships. Was that what this winter would bring as well? She opened the door of her cabin and stepped inside. Instead of the usual joy she felt after a day well spent, she suddenly felt the loneliness overwhelm her. As she walked through the cabin, closing windows to keep out the cool evening air, she found herself thinking of Spencer and his twins. What were their evenings like? What would it be like to live with a man who was a good father, a man who would never lift a hand in anger or raise his voice in an argument? Although they were without a mother, Spencer's twins were a delight. They were well-mannered and well-behaved, a testament to his skills as a father. She made herself a pot of tea, foregoing dinner because of the many thoughts circling in her mind. Until today, she had never given Spencer a second thought, and now that she finally allowed herself to truly investigate her feelings, she realized that the happiest days at the mercantile were, in fact, the days on which Spencer and the twins stopped by. A smile curved her mouth as she realized that he was coming in more and more on his own recently. She had no idea what to do about the feelings of interest she had for Spencer. But she promised that if Spencer and his twins were her second chance at happiness, she would grab it with both hands. A contented sigh escaped her as she imagined spending her evenings in the kitchen with Spencer and sitting down to a family dinner with the twins. The image was beautiful, warm, and happy. It was an image she fell asleep with, one she woke up with the following morning. Chapter 16. Ever since Mrs. Jones mentioned the reason behind Spencer's frequent visits to the mercantile, Carol had been intrigued by him. Before, she had only admired him from afar, but now when he stopped and talked for a while, before saying what item he didn't really need, she found herself admiring him from up close. Spencer Boardman was different to all the men Carol had met in her life. He didn't talk down to the twins, and when he talked to her, he didn't look at her as someone who could do his chores and lighten his load. He looked at her like someone who mattered. It was a heady feeling, especially for a girl who had spent most of her life just getting by. Whereas she had once found joy in her solitary life, she now finally allowed herself to dream again. She was dusting the shelves and daydreaming when the bells jingled on the door. "Good morning, Spencer," Mrs. Jones called from the counter. "How are you doing this morning?" Carol turned to see Spencer and the twins standing in the doorway, smiling at Mrs. Jones. "Very well, thank you. I was just telling the twins it's a beautiful morning to take a walk down to the pond. Ranching slower this time of year, ain't it?" Mrs. Jones nodded. "Hello, Carol," Spencer said, turning to meet her gaze. Carol's heart skipped a beat as she stumbled over her words. She summoned a smile and nodded at the children. "Hello, Spencer, Holly, Nicholas." "Pa said we can have some candy for our walk down to the pond," Nicholas announced proudly. "That sounds like a fine plan." Carol smiled at the boy as she led him to the candy shelves. "What candy did you have in mind? Do you have some of those red and white striped candies for Christmas? We had some last year," Holly added. Carol chuckled as she searched through the new consignment of candies for the candy canes. She handed one to each child, and when she looked up, Spencer was standing closer than before. She could smell leather and horses on him and found it the most amazing aroma ever. "Thank you, Carol," Spencer said with a smile. For a moment, the children and Mrs. Jones faded into the background. All Carol could feel was her heart racing and her eyes unable to turn away from his. "Would you like to join us?" Spencer asked, searching her gaze. Carol began shaking her head just as Mrs. Jones' voice carried to her. "She'd love to. I was just telling her this morning that she needs to take her breaks. Some fresh air will do her good." Carol's jaw dropped as Mrs. Jones accepted the invitation on her behalf. It wasn't that she didn't want to take a walk with Spencer and his children. It was merely a matter of not being sure of his intentions. Great," Spencer said as he moved to the counter to pay for the candies. When a tiny hand slipped into hers, Carol's breath caught. She glanced down to see Holly smiling up at her. "Us girls can walk together." Carol felt her heart swell. Holly had never had a mother, and it was the first time Carol realized how the little girl was outnumbered at home. A smile curved the corners of her mouth. "I'd like that very much." Spencer and Nicholas headed out, and just as Holly and Carol followed, Mrs. Jones made a hissing sound to catch her attention. "Opportunities don't come knocking every day, Carol, and when they do, you should open the door." Carol smiled gratefully. Mrs. Jones was the closest person to a mother she'd had in years, and she didn't intend on closing this door if Spencer just asked her to open it. As she and Holly stepped outside, Holly frowned up at her. "I didn't hear any knocking." Carol laughed with a nod. "Neither did I." Together they walked down to the pond. Spencer and Nicholas were in deep conversation about how the fishing would be this time of year, while Holly felt it imperative to tell Carol about all her dolls and the playhouse she fashioned from old crates for her dolls. "They're all stacked, but I don't mind. Because there's a bedroom, a kitchen, and a living room. I don't have furniture or nuttin', but I pretend." Holly stopped, and Carol waited for her to continue. "Do you like to play pretend?" Carol smiled, remembering how much she had loved it as a child. "I love playing pretend. I always pretended my dolls were princesses." "That's nice," Holly said eagerly before dropping Carol's hand and racing after her brother to the edge of the pond. For a moment, Carol wasn't sure what she should do next. With the children there as a buffer, she had no need to talk to Spencer just yet. He turned and smiled as he walked towards her. "Is this all right? I wasn't sure. I didn't plan on asking you to come with us." Carol frowned, unsure whether he meant it wasn't all right for him or that he regretted asking her to join them. "I could go?" Spencer shook his head and let out a sigh. "No, that's not what I meant at all." A soft chuckle escaped him. I'm a little out of practice. I hope you'll forgive me." Carol smiled. "I'm a little out of practice, too," she lied. Never before had she been courted by a handsome man, and Carol was unsure of what was expected next. Spencer smiled. "It's nice to get to know each other outside the store, isn't it?" Carol laughed softly. "You mean without Mrs. Jones's watchful eye?" "I don't mind a chaperone, just eavesdropping," he admitted. "Although it doesn't really make a difference now, does it? Before you get back to the mercantile, the entire town will know you took a walk with me." "Does that bother you?" Carol asked, curiously. Although she was recently widowed, Spencer had dearly loved his wife, from what she heard. Moving on would be more difficult for Spencer, but then Carol had her own fears she needed to slay. Spencer searched her gaze before a smile finally broadened his mouth. I don't mind one bit. To be honest, I've been trying to gather the courage to ask you on a walk for months. At first, I knew you were grieving. Carol's heart fluttered on the wings of hope. Spencer liked her, and he had liked her for some time. For a moment, she wondered if she should be honest about her marriage to Michael, but finally decided there was no other way. If she wanted whatever was happening between her and Spencer, he deserved to know the truth. I didn't grieve, that sounds horrible, she said, shaking her head. My marriage to Michael, it wasn't one of love and affection, one could say. Spencer frowned, confused. Then why did you marry him? I don't speak ill of the dead, but he wasn't the kindest man I've ever met. Carol nodded and drew in a deep breath before she finally told Spencer about losing her mother and her life in New York. She explained about the letters and how he had lied to her from the beginning. When she got to the part about her wedding on Christmas Eve, Spencer reached for her hand. His touch was warm and comforting as he searched her gaze. Carol, no woman deserves to be lied to and trapped into a loveless marriage. I'm sorry that happened to you. Carol shrugged. It's over now. I think that once upon a time, Michael was the man that he described to me, but life hardened and soured him. I'll never insult you by expecting of you what he did, Spencer said quietly. I believe that marriage should be a union of love. If I think of Daisy... A sad smile curved his mouth as he glanced at the children playing on the banks of the pond. We loved each other deeply. I won't lie and say we never argued, but when we did, we always managed to find a way through it. She sounds like a wonderful woman. You must miss her very much? Carol asked against her will. She knew that Spencer had loved before, and she didn't want the memory of that love to lessen her chances of finding it. She was. Spencer drew in a sharp breath. I still miss her, but I think I've reached the point where I think fondly of our memories together instead of with anger. The night the twins were born, she asked me to promise her something on her dying bed. Carol felt honored that Spencer was opening up to her in this way, but she couldn't help but feel like an intruder into his mind and memories. What did she ask? Spencer glanced at the children before meeting Carol's gaze. She asked me to open my heart to love again, to find a mother for the twins. Of course, I agreed, but I never considered really doing it. These last 5 years have been harder in more ways than one, but I never even thought of finding a wife again. I'm starting to think it's time to honor Daisy's dying wish. Carol's breath caught, realizing what he meant. When he asked her for a walk, she expected a frivolous chat about inconsequential things. She never thought that Spencer Boardman would open his heart to her with such honesty. She swallowed past the overwhelming emotions bubbling through her body. After Michael, I gave up on my dreams. I thought I'd be content with living a solitary life, but now I'm starting to wonder if that life can ever be fulfilling. Spencer smiled at her with a hooded expression. Might be the seasons aren't the only thing changing round here. Carol laughed softly, realizing he was still holding her hand. That might just be. Chapter 17. Carol had never taken as many walks as she did over the last few weeks, and every single one of those walks was memorable. So memorable that she didn't even notice the chilly wind or the curious looks from the townsfolk. Every time she saw Spencer, she couldn't believe that he really liked her. Of that, there wasn't a single doubt in her mind. Unlike with Michael, there were no letters, only heartfelt conversations while the children played close by. Over the last month, Carol hadn't only started to fall for Spencer, she had fallen in love with the twins as well. Their curiosity and unbridled joy were contagious, and Carol couldn't wait to be infected every time she saw them. Carol smiled as she turned to Spencer while they rode together in the wagon. It was the morning of Thanksgiving, and for the first time in years, she knew it would be a happy one. She wasn't hiding in the Smithers home or working in the factory. This year, she wouldn't be slaving away over a meal for a man who didn't appreciate her effort. This year, she had been invited to spend Thanksgiving with Spencer and the twins. Carol had prepared a roast the day before and had changed 3 times before Spencer and the twins came to collect her a short while ago. She invited them to spend Thanksgiving with her at her home, but Spencer insisted they fetch her to spend the day at his ranch. Carol couldn't help but be curious to see Spencer's ranch. From the gossip grapevine in town, she knew that his ranch was one of the largest in the area, but other than that, she didn't know much about Spencer. She was curious to see how he was with the children at home, but more than anything, she was curious to see if she would enjoy spending the whole day with Spencer and his children. "We're almost there," Nicholas said, pointing to a house in the distance. Carol narrowed her gaze to see a large house in the distance. For a moment, her breath caught, realizing Spencer wasn't just a rancher, but a very successful one. The cabin was large, at least big enough for 4 rooms, she guessed as they drew closer. The barn was almost 4 times the size of the small barn she had on Michael's property. In the distance, the snowy landscape was dotted with cattle. She turned to Spencer with a curious look. "This is all yours?" Spencer shrugged. "It's not much, but it's home." Carol smiled at his humble answer. "It's beautiful." "Wait till you see the cabin. Pa made us clean up before we came to fetch you. We even had to set the table with the good silver." Carol couldn't help but laugh at Carol's petulant look. "Well, I appreciate it very much. It's a good thing I made my good roast then." "Is that what's in the basket?" Nicholas asked curiously, looking at the basket that sat between him and his sister. Carol nodded as the wagon slowed to a halt. In front of the cabin was a wide porch, perfect for watching the sunset, or just finding some shade in the heat of the day. Spencer helped the children down before holding out his hand to her. "Welcome to our home." Carol smiled into his gaze. "Thank you for inviting me." Spencer held her gaze once she was standing on her feet before him. "I have a lot to be grateful for this year." Carol felt her heart skip a beat again. Although neither she nor Spencer had mentioned their feelings or where their frequent walks would lead, she had a feeling that just perhaps it might lead to a future she had always dreamed of. Over the last few days, she had allowed herself to start dreaming again, dreaming of a future with Spencer and the twins. She wanted to be the woman Spencer turned to for both support and affection. She wanted to be a mother to the twins, but more than anything, she wanted them to be a family. Being invited to their home for Thanksgiving, Carol could only hope was a step in that direction. Spencer opened the door and stood back to let her in. Carol couldn't stop the smile that curved her mouth as she stepped inside. Spencer's home was not stiff and unwelcoming like the Smithers home had been, nor was it neglected and cold like Michael's home had been on her arrival. It was warm and well-loved. Toys were scattered on the rug by the fire, drapes hung on the windows, and without even asking, Carol knew that the blanket over the back of the couch had been made by his former wife. For a moment, she wondered if she would be ready to take the place of a woman who had been so loved. Would she ever be able to fill the shoes that Daisy left behind? Fear clutched at her heart as she turned to see Spencer watching her. He swallowed visibly before taking her hand. "I wasn't sure if it would feel right bringing another woman here, but seeing you here feels right." Carol's heart soared. "It does feel right." "Can we eat now?" Nicholas chirped beside them. Carol and Spencer shared a laugh before Spencer answered. "Nicholas, why don't you help me carve the meat? That's a man's work." "Holly, do you want to show Carol our home?" Holly rushed to Carol's side. "Come, when we're done, we can play pretend." Carol felt her heart overflow with joy as Holly showed her the home. She might not be Spencer's first wife or the twins' mother, but slowly but surely, it felt as if they were making room for her in their lives. Perhaps one day, there would be room enough for her to stay. Chapter 18. It had been a long day at the store. Christmas was only 2 weeks away, and it was as if half the town only now realized that they needed gifts, decorations, and extra rations for the festive season. Her feet were aching as she walked out of town, but her heart was floating on a cloud, as it did most of the time of late. She was falling so deeply in love with Spencer and the twins that not even Mrs. Jones' teasing could stop her from smiling for most of the day. Thanksgiving had been the best she'd ever had. She had spent the day playing with the children, talking to Spencer, and being grateful for having met them. It was hard to believe how unhappy she had been all the years before over the Christmas season now that she had finally found happiness. Carol knew that wherever their relationship was headed, it might take time to finally get there, but she didn't mind the wait. She was enjoying every moment of her courtship with Spencer. He was the most thoughtful man she'd ever met. When he wasn't stopping by the mercantile to steal her away for a walk, he would surprise her with an invitation to dinner or a posy of flowers. Carol had always dreamed of loving deeply, but she had never realized just how deep that love could grow in such a short time. She found herself thinking of Spencer when he wasn't around, and when he was around, she found herself dreaming of the future. For someone who had suffered so much heartache in her life, it was foreign not to feel sad all the time. Her prayers had changed from begging for a future to being grateful for Spencer and the twins. As she approached her cabin, she noticed smoke bubbling from the chimney, and a frown creased her brow. She had been gone the whole day, and the fire would have simmered down by now if it hadn't died. The only reason there would be smoke bubbling from her chimney was if someone had put logs on the fire. Fear clutched at her heart, realizing someone was in her house. She stopped, feeling her whole body freeze in terror. There had been rumors around town about a gang of highwaymen heading their way. Everyone had been told to keep a lookout, and right now, Carol wasn't sure if she should run or if she should hide. She had no defense against a gang of highwaymen. After finally finding happiness, she could not fathom losing it now, not when she was so close to the happily ever after she had always dreamed of. Just as she decided it would be safer to head back to town, the door opened and a man stepped outside. Carol's heart began to race with fear, and then he held up a hand and waved. "Are you going to stand out there and freeze, or are you going to come in?" Relief washed over her as she recognized Spencer's voice. He and the twins had been over for lunch twice since Thanksgiving, but she never expected them to surprise her on her return from work. Carol felt a smile lift the corners of her mouth as she hastened her pace to get inside. As soon as she moved up the porch, Spencer shook his head in dismay. "I'm sorry. I should have realized we were going to give you a fright. We wanted to surprise you." Carol sighed with relief. "I'm just glad it's you. For a moment I thought it was a gang of highwaymen that had taken shelter here." Spencer shook his head as he reached for her hand and pressed a kiss to it. "It's just us. We'll take care of you." Carol searched his gaze and shook her head. "We'll take care of each other." Spencer shifted nervously as Carol heard the children snickering inside. "Actually, that's why we're here." Carol frowned and started towards the door when Spencer shook his head. "Before you go inside, there is something I need to tell you." "Spencer?" Carol asked, wondering what was going on. "Carol, when I lost Daisy, I never thought I'd find love or happiness again. I was content spending the rest of my days raising my children. But then I met you. At first, I was sure my heart was fooling me that I wouldn't be ready to love again, but Daisy was right." Carol felt her heart began to race as she searched his gaze. "Right about what?" "Loving another woman doesn't mean that I'll forget her. It just means that I have a big heart. I love you. Carol, I love you more than I thought I would ever love again. I know that you've been through a lot, and I know that you're a little cautious when it comes to commitment after Michael. But I want to promise you that I'll never hurt you, not intentionally." "Spencer?" Carol breathed his name as she realized what was happening. She had hoped that one day their relationship would head in this direction. She just never realized it would be this soon. "Carol, I think it's time you stepped inside," Spencer said with a mysterious smile. Carol frowned as she opened the door. Laughter bubbled from her throat when she saw the twins kneeling with beaming grins. "Miss Carol, will you be our new ma?" Carol felt tears slipping over her cheeks even as she felt Spencer's hands settle on her shoulders. His voice was barely more than a whisper, but it made her heart soar. "Carol, will you be my wife?" Carol smiled as she turned to look at Spencer. "Are you sure?" Spencer chuckled as the children rushed to their sides. "I don't think I would have come over here. cooked a meal, and asked the twins for their blessing if I wasn't sure. Will you be part of our family? Will you let us be yours? Carol's heart overflowed with joy as she nodded. Spencer, I'd be honored. I'm not sure I'll be a good wife, but I promise I'll try. I'll try my best to be a good mother to your twins, to be there for them always. Spencer brushed away her tears and smiled into her gaze. I know you will. Can we call Miss Carol, Ma? Holly asked, tugging on her father's arm. Spencer smiled down at his daughter before meeting Carol's gaze. You can call her Ma. The word made a warm feeling of love wrap around Carol, even as Spencer tilted her chin so she could meet his gaze again. I know we never spoke about this, but just perhaps one day we can grow our family even more. The thought of having a baby of her own made Carol laugh. I'd like that very much. She looked at the twins and knew that God had finally given her a new future. The future she had dreamed of, the family she had always wanted, and all in time for Christmas. Chapter 19. 5 years ago, Carol had lost her mother, and Spencer had lost his wife. The years in between might have been fraught with grief. But as Carol glanced down at the beautiful white dress Mrs. Jones had given her as a wedding gift, she didn't feel sad over the memories that Christmas held anymore. Tonight, she would say her vows to a man she loved, to a man she knew would always protect and support her, a man who was so different from the man that she had come to Black Mountain for in the first place. When Spencer had proposed, she had been blown away. It had been so soon after their courtship had begun, but then, as Spencer had told her afterward, it had felt right. And right now, Carol couldn't argue with him. It did feel right. It felt more right than anything in her life before. Over the last 2 years, she had kept in contact with Patty, and although Patty had been horrified to hear about her fate at first, she was elated that Carol too had found happiness in the West. She might have been lured here by deceitful lies, but it was here that she had found her truth. She had found that not everyone was mean and regarding her only as a means to an end. It was here that she learned that true love did exist, and it was here that she understood that becoming a mother didn't always mean carrying a child. Her love for the twins was the only love that rivaled her love for Spencer. In such a short time, she had come to care for them as if they were her own. Nicholas was still shy and a little withdrawn, but opened up to Carol in ways she never expected. After the engagement, Nicholas had been the first to start calling her Ma, and had once confided in her how he had always dreamed of finding a mother again, and that he just never thought that dream would come true. Holly reveled in her presence. She insisted that Carol play with her and bake with her, and even play dress up. She was an adorable little girl, and Carol already knew that she would use the hardships of her past to protect Holly. She would make sure that Holly was never fooled by smooth words or humiliated to be less than she truly was. Carol drew in a deep breath as she turned in a full circle with Holly by her side. The day before, everyone had helped Carol move her possession over to her new home. The night before, she had spent the evening in Holly's room, but tonight she would move into Spencer's room. If she had been afraid that Daisy's memory would make her feel unwelcome, she had been wrong. Although she had never known Daisy, Carol had visited her grave soon after the engagement and promised to take good care of her family. Daisy had become the friend she had never met, the woman who had not only gifted her with 2 beautiful children, but a husband who knew that love should be cherished. They're waiting for us, Holly said, peeking out the door. Mr. Jones, the preacher, and the sheriff are here. Carol nodded and was about to leave to say her vows when she stopped and closed her eyes. She said a quiet prayer of thanks before she apologized for doubting God's plan with her life. When she opened her eyes, Holly's smile was bright. Come, Ma, it's time for Pa to see how pretty you look. Carol laughed as she allowed Holly to lead her into the living room where everyone was waiting. For a moment, she felt self-conscious, dressed all in white. This wasn't the first time she was saying her vows, but it was the first time she would mean them. Spencer caught her eye, and a smile curved his mouth. All the doubts fled from her mind as she knew that whatever her marriage with Michael was, her marriage to Spencer would be different in every way. This was the man God had chosen for her, and this was the man she planned to spend the rest of her life with. Heasing Siemens, he walked to her and took her hand before showing her the Christmas tree. The children insisted we be married beside a Christmas tree to honor Christmas, just like they were born on Christmas. Carol felt a tear slip over her cheek as she remembered how beautiful she had considered Christmas trees before one had taken her mother in the fire. This tree had no candles, and yet somehow it was even more beautiful than the tree in the Smithers home. The decorations were made by the children with the star formed from twined twigs, but it was the most beautiful tree Carol had ever seen. She turned to Spencer and smiled. Just as our life together will begin on Christmas Eve. Epilogue. The aroma of roast beef hung in the air, mingling with that of the cinnamon cookies that had been baked earlier that morning. The twins were sitting by the tree, guessing which gifts were theirs, even as Spencer carried in more gifts from the barn. Carol had never known such joy as she had come to know over the last year. All the grief that Christmas had brought her so many years ago had eased, and somehow she had come to love Christmas again. Not only was it a celebration of the twins' birthdays, it was also the anniversary of her wedding to Spencer. She filled the cups to the brim with the hot cocoa she had just prepared, and then she moved to the fireplace where the children were eagerly waiting to open their gifts. Spencer came in with the last gift, and both twins gasped at the sight. Holly frowned and shook her head. "Pa, I already play with my crib, so it's not fair to give me Nicholas' crib as a gift." Spencer chuckled as he glanced at Carol. "Maybe it isn't your gift." "Can we open them now?" Nicholas asked, rushing to Carol's side. Carol brushed a hand over his sleep-mussed hair and felt her heart expand with love. She already looked forward to seeing the man Nicholas would one day become. She had no doubt in her mind that he would be just as loving and caring as his father. "In a while, first there is something we need to do as a family." She glanced at Spencer, who nodded as he collected 2 candles. Carol had them special ordered from back east the moment she had seen them in the catalog at the Mercantile. These weren't just any old candles, but beautiful, large, scented candles. She stood up and joined him at the mantelpiece before turning to the children. "It was your idea, you tell them," Spencer said, smiling at her with love in his gaze. Carol nodded and turned to the children. "This year we're going to start a new tradition as a family, a tradition to remember the people we loved who now look over us from heaven. This first candle is for you, Ma. Daisy, would you like to light it?" Nicholas rushed forward and took the candle. "So, if we look at it, we can know she's here with us on Christmas Day?" Spencer nodded. "Exactly. And the other candle is for Carol's mother. She passed away on the same night the 2 of you were born." "That's so sad," Holly said, glancing at Carol. There was a time the grief would have overwhelmed Carol, but over the last year, she had come to realize that everything that had happened to her over the last year had brought her to the life she now shared with Spencer and the twins. "Just like you, I'll always miss my ma, but I know she'll be glad we found each other." The candles were lit, and for a moment silence reigned, as if even the children knew it was a special moment. When Spencer finally turned to her, mischief was dancing in his expression. "Should we tell them?" Carol smiled with a nod. "I think it's time they knew." "Knew what?" Holly asked indignantly. Carol kneeled and met Holly's face. "I know you already have your crib for your dolls, but do you think you could find a little room to put this one in your room as well?" Carol nodded towards the crib under the tree. Holly frowned. "Why? What would I put in it?" Spencer chuckled as he glanced at Carol before turning to Holly. "A baby brother or sister, perhaps?" Nicholas punched the air. "Yee-haw!" Holly giggled exuberantly. "We're having a baby?" Carol nodded as she smiled at her family. "Come spring, our family will be blessed with another member." "Can we light a candle for the baby too? Since it's still in heaven, Matt, it will see we're thinking about it already." Nicholas asked eagerly, and Holly agreed. Spencer smiled as he wrapped an arm around Carol's shoulders. "I think that's a great idea, just like the one I had last year of marrying you." The candle was lit, and cocoa was enjoyed as gifts were unwrapped. As they sat by the fire, enjoying Christmas morning, Carol knew that life might have been hard at times, but it had never been sweeter. Both she and Spencer had lost so much and endured even more, but she knew that by God's grace, they would have a wonderful future together. A future with fires in the wintertime, cocoa at Christmas, and sunflowers in spring. A future of love, joy, and kindness, the future she had always dreamed of as a child. Her gaze traveled to the mantelpiece where 3 candles burned, and she knew that she would always be grateful for the memory of the women they represented. Her mother had given her the courage to always stand tall, even during the hardest of times, and Daisy had given her the twins. It might be hard to remember all they had lost, but it felt wonderful to realize how blessed they were. For the first time that morning, she thought about Michael and his accident a year before, and how guilty she felt for not grieving his death. She never mourned for the man who had deceived her, but at that moment, she wished she could have told him how grateful she was that he had brought her to Black Mountain. Carol might have been born and raised in New York, but in her heart, she was now a Western bride, one who could brand a steer, rope a horse, and when required, kill a rattler. They were all skills she never thought she would learn, but skills she had learned to appreciate, just as she had learned to appreciate what it felt like to be loved.